Croeso pawb, welcome all to tonight's lecture and thank you all for coming. My name is Jon Dollery and I'm the Mapping Officer at the Royal Commission for the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales. And tonight I'm going to give a lecture titled Mapping the Maps, Deep Mapping of Historic Cartographic Sources and Documentary Sources in North East Wales. And this is centred around a project that I'm currently working on, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, titled Deep Mapping of Estate Archives. So as part of this lecture, I'm going to be exploring some of these historic cartographic sources, and there's a range of them dating from 1870 right the way back to 1620. And what this project aims to do is to take all these sources and put them together in a digital environment known as GIS so that people can get access to them for free. So I'm going to be talking about the process of how we bring all these things together and the methodology for how we go through that. And then also at the end, I'd like to take the opportunity to go through and show you how you can get access to all this information at home. So this presentation is going to cover 5 broad topics. The first is going to cover cartography and boundaries, the basics. It's just going to give you a bit of context and a bit of overview about what we mean when we talk about these things. The second is going to look in detail at some of the types of historic maps that we have for the United Kingdom and by extension Wales. The third is going to talk specifically about the project and the aims and objectives of what we want to achieve. The fourth is going to expand on the methodology of how we're going to bring all these data sets together into one environment and how you can get access to them. And then obviously the fifth final part is going to be giving you the tools to be able to access this information at home for free, hopefully following this project. And God willing, hopefully we'll switch over to a live me in the future, and I'll give you a demonstration of the website and side of things and how you can use this data online. So why is understanding maps and boundaries important? Well, firstly, maps themselves are fundamental in helping us to understand how we see the tangible landscape around us. Although what we've got to remember is that what maps depict isn't necessarily truth, in the sense that all maps, even modern ones, are subjective, but this is even more so when we look at historic cartographic sources. We've always got to remember that maps only show what the cartographer wants to be shown and what they've chosen to survey out in the field. And again, like I said before, maps are reflections of an idealised landscape. And what this tends to be is the idealised landscape of the time, in the sense that, like I said before, the cartographer goes out and, draws or surveys the landscape and then draws the map. But usually, in a historical context, these surveyors are being paid to do this by, well, usually wealthy landowners. So things like estate maps, those people are being, told to go out and survey an estate. So the landscape they are depicting is the landscape of the gentry, and that necessarily doesn't, that's a very upper class, view of the landscape. So when we look at historic sources, we've always got to keep that in mind, that it is a very specific one-sided view that we are getting. But it's still important that we understand that, of course, because, we can then infer socio and economic times of the times they were created. And, the key thing with all these maps as well is that although they're subjective and we must take them like any historic documentary source, they do provide us a time capsule of past landscape and how landscape was used in the past. So they do give us a window, quite literally, into how the past landscape may have been constituted. Another important aspect that we need to understand in terms of landscape and landscape history, and boundaries are fascinating because they are all human constructs. Boundaries can be both physical, they can exist in the landscape to demarcate a difference between one area and another. Maybe that's a property, or maybe that could be the boundary between one county and another. But they can also be intangible. They to some extent, all boundaries are not only physical, but they also exist in our own mind, in our own psyche. Like I said before, boundaries can range from the macro. So we're all familiar with Wales as a country. That in one respect is a boundary. But then it can also go to things like county, region, parish. So these things can be massive, but they can also be quite small. You know, they can range to a property. You know, every house or apartment we live in is in one respect a boundary. You know, that is our property. But you can also have things like a field parcel. You know, like an area of land. They're all usually demarcated from one parcel to another. So these things are fascinating. What's also important to understand is how these things have changed over time. And, you know, being able to define when boundaries come into existence and how they've changed is also integral to understand the importance that our ancestors placed upon a boundary. You know, boundaries give us an inkling into how our ancestors viewed the landscape and geography. You know, it's one thing to look at a map to be able to recreate a landscape, but then there's also the psychological thing behind that as well, is, you know, how did our ancestors actually view it? You know, because the boundaries that we have today could significantly be very different to what they were 300 years ago. So being able to understand how they've developed, when they developed, and how they've changed over time is also equally as important as you know, understanding the landscape and how that's developed too. And in historical context, you know, like I say, understanding our ancestors' concept is fundamental when we look at landscape regression. You know, like I say, it's one thing just to be able to say, well, this land or this parcel was used as a forest at one point, then got chopped down or whatever. You know, it's being able to, you know, if there's a boundary around it, well, when did that come into being, and why did it come into being? So being able to understand those things is also as crucial as the landscape regression or understand the landscape itself. So whilst on the topic of boundaries, what I want to do now is just give a quick breakdown of the types of administrative boundaries in Wales. And the reason I want to do this is I want to show how these things can truly be both modern as well as ancient, and that some boundaries can be quite, you know, relatively young in terms of our understanding, and some of them can be, you know, go back hundreds of years. The problem that we've got with boundaries as well, as I'd like to expand on, is that especially in administrative stuff, the last type of work that was done on this was done about 1954 by William Rees. So we're long overdue to be able to understand the types of macro boundaries that exist in Wales. You know, the work that Rees did in 1954, the Historical Atlas of Wales, you know, really needs to be updated. And now that we're in the 21st century, we have things like GIS and mapping, that we can actually do digital constructs of these things and be able to tie dates down more firmly on things. So one of the things that I hope this project will do is be the start of this catalyst to be able to unpick a lot of these administrative boundaries, you know, from different levels. So from the country to county, all the way down to parish and township. Anyway, just to give you an overview of the type of boundaries, the first one we'll all be familiar with is the country boundary. So as you can see on screen, this is the Wales, you know, the country boundary of Wales. You know, and this has been extant since the 16th century, since the Act of Union. But if we go below that, you've then got the county boundary. And again, as the Act of Union, these things came in. A lot of you will be familiar with county boundaries. Again, these have had several iterations over time. And in fact, some of you may remember when they used to be historic. I mean, you know, county boundaries have changed in 1974, for instance. But what you can see here is the historic, you know, all the way back to, this is about, you know, 1600. So things like Merionethshire, Carmarthenshire, Radnorshire, things like that. So we can see that, you know, below the country, it's then divided into county boundaries. Below the county boundary, or before then, you had the cantrev. Now, before the counties came to extant, before the Act of Union, Wales was divided into a series of cantrevs. Now, cantrev is a Welsh word, roughly translates as 100 settlements. And we believe that these go back certainly to the medieval period and potentially could be earlier. We know that there are some references to cantrevs in the earlier thing, commots, that go back to at least the 9th century. So the cantrev itself was an area that was controlled by a chieftain, or potentially, you know, later on it was a Welsh prince or something like that, and that they would then be divided into smaller commots. And usually the rule tended to be that a cantrev was divided into 3 commots, although There are areas like Carmarthenshire which are divided into several. But again, these are smaller areas, but they only existed in the medieval period. They were then superseded in the Act of Union and then completely went out of existence. But what's interesting is that a lot of the county boundaries reused a lot of the boundaries that were established by the cantrevs and then by demarcation, the commots. So a lot of these boundaries, although they don't exist today, may still exist in some form or another, or in stretches with later boundaries. Then below them, and again going back quite a fair way, are the parish boundaries. And again, parishes are very interesting because commots were then further divided into parishes, and these usually had some inclination with churches. And again, these have changed over time. There have been some which haven't changed at all and go back hundreds of years. But then there have been some which were changed in the 18th and 19th century. So being able to unpick how parishes have changed and our understanding, again, we need to understand how those things have changed over time. And then below the parish, you would then have the township. And again, this is one of the most interesting areas from my point of view, because there's not any, or there's no detailed maps that exist of townships digitally, I should say. So there are maps that do depict the townships, but they're not readily available. And as we'll go on when we talk about the historic sources, we'll see that they're sometimes quite hard to get access to. And I think we're in a position now where we can actually take a lot of this information to create digital data sets of these townships. So an example you've got on screen there is Llandegla, and that was divided into two townships, which is Trefedd and Llan. And again, being able to understand how where do these townships come from. Again, a lot of the time, especially we know for this area, Llandegla, that goes back to medieval area. It goes back a long time, and in fact we've got references to Trefedd again going back to the 11th century. So we know there's a historic prescience for a lot of these boundaries. So being able to understand how they've changed over time in terms of the administration is important to understand in landscape as well. So there are thousands of historical maps relating to the United Kingdom that have been created from around the 16th century all the way through to the 20th century. Well, and of course maps are still being made today. But there are 5 key mapping sources that are integral to being able to understand past landscape. So the first one, which is probably one of the most important, is the first edition Ordnance Survey maps. And these were surveyed between 1868 and 1888 in the area that we're looking at. The second is also then the Ordnance Survey town plans. These were drawn at the same time as the first edition survey maps, but go in much greater detail, and there's only a certain amount that exists because only towns that were over a certain amount of population were ever surveyed. You've then got the tithe survey for England and Wales. These range in date from 1836 to about 1850. And again, these are an invaluable source because they give us much information about not only the landscape, but also of past land use. You've then also got the Acts of Enclosure. Again, these are very interesting sources because they show landscape both as it was designed to be during the Acts of Enclosure, but also gives us inferences of what the landscape looked like or existed before the Acts of Enclosure were passed. And then you've also got various estate maps which, depending on the area, could range in date from about 1600 all the way to about 1850. So the first mapping source we're going to look at is the first edition Ordnance Survey maps that were surveyed between 1840 and 1880 across England and Wales. And these maps are very important because they record a phenomenal amount of detail. Firstly, they were done at a scale unprecedented in this period. They were done at a scale of 1 to 2500 or 25 inch to the mile. And they record almost every building, every field, every land parcel, as well as in some cases even individual trees. So the amount of effort that was put into these maps is unique. The other thing that's interesting about them is that they are cadastral. So each field was given a number, and in some references, and especially Flintshire and Denbighshire, which were the very early ones to be done, they then had books of reference like the tithe, which they then recorded what field, what each field was being used for. So they also recorded things like land use. Later first edition maps don't have that because the amount of time it was taken to do that was quite arduous, and they decided that the most important thing was to actually just get the recording done, and then to put things like acreages and stuff on the map itself. What is also phenomenal about these maps is that they are the basis of modern mapping. So the first edition was the prototype, which they went out and surveyed the whole landscape, and then they revised it with second edition, third editions, and this tradition goes right the way up to today. And in fact, a lot of the fields that we'll see on these maps are obviously still extant today as well. So the map you can see on screen is actually of Trything. And just to give you an example, you know, the type of things they record, you've got Offers Dyke here, obviously very important historic site in this area, and you can see the amount of detail that has been put on these maps. You know, you've got colorized buildings, you can see where streams are, and also you've got the hashing and things like that. It's very clear to use. Like I say as well, because these maps were cadastral, here's an example of the book of reference for the parish of Mould. And you can see here that each parcel was given a number, and like you say, you'd have the area in terms of acreage, which later versions they have on the map, and then you've also got remarks, which are basically things like land use. So, you know, a field if it was pasture or arable, or if it was wood and things like that. Again, the importance of this data set is that we can use this not only, you know, was it the basis for modern mapping, we can also use this as the basis to hang historic or older mapping off, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later when we talk about the methodology. But suffice to say that the importance of being able to understand this mapping source is crucial in landscape regression and things like that. So the next type of historic mapping source, which was done in conjunction when the first edition 25-inch was being surveyed, are the town plans. So each town that was over a population of 4,000 was surveyed in extra detail of 1 to 500, which equates to about 10.56 feet to the mile. So these plans only consisted of the major town area, and they would record, again, phenomenal detail of almost each individual building footprint, garden, you know, stream, railway, things like that. And again, the amount of detail that these maps have in terms of urban setting is absolutely phenomenal. So the example you can see on screen is just an extract from the southern portion of the town plan for Mould. And you can see that these are colorized, so you can work out what are individuals. And again, what was interesting here is any public building, they not only surveyed the outside, but they also surveyed the interior. So you can see to the south of this picture here, you've got the Methodist Chapel in Mould, and the interior has also been surveyed as well. So again, these are a phenomenal resource, and again, later on, hopefully I'll talk about, you know, once these have been digitized, the type of things we can do. But once these are digitized, you know, you can then link other sources to these things, such as census records and things like that, because you've got the individual footprints of buildings. You know, you can actually start working out where people lived and things like that, and the actual extent of each property. But these are very unique because they give us a perspective of an urban area, and an urban area, you know, back in the 1800s. And obviously Mould has grown since then, although a lot of the properties that you'll see here, again, are still extant today. But the actual environs of Mould in terms of its size, you know, it has increased threefold since it was surveyed in 1880. So we can work from a landscape archaeology position in terms of how an urban setting is developed. We can take a snapshot of how it was in 1880, sorry, all the way through to today, and we can see those different sections of how the town has developed over time. So again, a fantastic resource to use. So the next type of maps we're going to talk about is the Tithe Survey of England and Wales that was compiled between 1836 to about 1850, although there were some time maps produced after them. So the tithe maps themselves came out of the Tithe Commutation Act of 1836, and basically the act of tithe goes back a long way, in fact to the medieval period, and this is where the church could take a tax from the local population in the parish, that they would give a third of their produce, whether that be livestock, fish, animals, whatever, and they would give a third of that produce to the church for the year. And in 1836 it was decided, rather than having those produce contributions, that they would change it to a monetary contribution. So these maps were produced in order to work out and calculate how much each landowner and also the occupier would have to pay in the form of tithe to the local church. So these maps are a great example of when maps are produced for tax purposes, and some of the most famous historic documentary sources also have links to tax. So things like Doomsday very much fit into this vein. So the tithe maps themselves are a fantastic resource. Again, they show the landscape in a level of detail. They show each field. They do show buildings, although one of the things I will say is that when they do depict buildings, they tend to be an approximation rather than a physical they've surveyed them in. And again, tithe maps are quite interesting because the level of survey, because they were surveyed at different times by different surveyors, tends to vary. So the example you can see on screen now is Trything, and you can see it's very clear, and you can see the numbers of each field. Again, these are cadastral, so they have a book of reference, so each number refers to the book of reference, which gives information about the occupier, the owner, land use and things like that. But there are other maps which don't survive quite well. So this is an example of the tithe map for Llanberis, and you can see it hasn't survived well. The survey itself as well is very opaque, so some of these maps can be a challenge to use. The other thing about these maps is that there were many different copies produced and are held by different organisations. So in terms of archives, some of the tithe maps are held by the National Library, some of them are held by the National Archives, some of them are held by local archive services, so it can be a real mix of who's got what. The interesting thing about the copies, though, is that the National Library did a project a couple of years ago to digitise all of the tithe maps that they held. So you can get access to the images of these online as we speak through something called Places of Wales, which was produced as part of the Cynefin project. But suffice to say, again, these are a fantastic resource. They do give us information about land ownership and of who occupied the land. And in some cases, they do give us land use. Again, because these were surveyed by different people over different periods, some surveyors recorded land use, some didn't. So it really is potluck about which survey you get, how detailed it is, how good it is, because they do tend to vary from place to place. And this is just an example of the book of pagination or the book of reference. So you can see here that that each field would be given a number, that number would tally over to the book of reference, and in the book of reference you'd have information about the landowner, the occupier, how many roods, acres and perches, and then the calculation of, because they owned that many roods, acres and perches, what the actual cost of the tithe would be. So again, a fantastic resource that pushes the mapping. Since we looked at the first edition, that's about 1870, 1880, this is 1840, so you can see chronologically we're starting to go back further in time. So the acts of enclosure or enclosure maps are also another phenomenal resource that we can use to better understand how landscape is developed. Again, these were produced at different scales depending on the period, and they basically adhere to the acts of enclosure that were passed by Parliament throughout this period. And what they are effectively is that as common land was sold, a map was produced. The common was then divided up into parcels or lots, and then those lots were then sold to local gentry or local landowners. So why these maps are fascinating is because they effectively give us two types of landscape. They show us the design landscape that would have been created as part of the the enclosure of this land. But if we take those parcels off, and we know which parcels were designed to be put in because of their symbology, we can actually work out what the common land would have constituted of. So, we can actually work out the common land, it's in its area before it was enclosed. And we know that that common land probably wouldn't have changed going right back into the medieval period and possibly even earlier. So these are a phenomenal resource in being able to understand, again, how landscape is developed. And also the other things that they show is that things like roads, trackways were also designed. So a lot of the trackways you'll see on some of these maps didn't exist prior to this map. So we can actually strip them off as well. So that really understands of how people commute across the landscape. Today we do have roads and stuff which go over upland areas. We go back 100, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, those things didn't exist. And yet because we are familiar with them now, there's this assumption that these things have always been there. So, they are an important source to be able to understand, not only how the landscape is developed, but also how people have traversed landscape as well. So the example you can see on screen is the enclosure map for Llandegla. And what's interesting about these features is that, like I say, they give us the landscape pre to enclosure. So where there's a solid line, that means that existed before this enclosure map was produced. So you can see you've got little bits of encroachment here. To the south there, you've got the late T. Williams, Samuel Jones. So those little acts of encroachment existed prior to this map. And this map was produced in 1830. So we know that those bits of the map were prior to 1830. Whereas everything that's 2 dots and a dash, that was designed to be put in. So we know that the field above that, well, that wasn't created until after 1830. The other important things about these maps is they also give us things like place name evidence, and sometimes they depict features. So you can see on this map, you've got a feature there called Cadar Rhys Dafydd, or the Chair of Rhys Dafydd. What that is, we don't know. But it doesn't exist on any other map. And in fact, it doesn't exist anywhere else in the historic record. So the fact that they're pointing out these, place names which may or may not have gone out of use, they help us fill in those gaps of those areas. And because they do tend to range a lot earlier than the first edition OS and the Tithe, they are an important resource to be able to give us not only the landowners to then chase the detective story on trying to see if did they have an estate map or anything, but they also fill in things like place names which may or may not have gone out of use as well. And the last type of historic source is the estate maps. Again, these are a fantastic resource. Different to the other maps in the sense that obviously they only cover smaller areas, so smaller estates, and depending on when they were surveyed, they can range in date from 1600 all the way up to 1880, that type of period. And sometimes it is potluck whether an estate did have a map produced or not. These maps are fantastic because they do give us an invaluable insight into estates and how they were managed and the type of landscape. But they are notorious to get hold of in the sense that depending on which archive it's in, it could be the local archive, it could be the National Archives, it could be the National Library. These things aren't necessarily always easy to get hold of. But when you can get hold of them, the information they provide is fantastic. So, the example we've got on screen now is from Nerquis Hall, and this was surveyed in 1734. So one of the oldest maps that we have for our project area. It's not the oldest, but certainly one of the oldest. But the type of information they have is fantastic. They have not only the landscape, and we can work out the fields, and in terms of surveyed quality, they do fit quite nicely with things that have been later surveyed. But they also have things like elevations of the houses, so you can see Plasnewydd there, which has been nicely drawn by the surveyor, as well as information about the landowner and things like that. So again, these are a fantastic resource and some of the oldest resource. They again, like the enclosure maps, they help us in terms of things that may have been lost, like field names, parcel names, place names. All this information which could exist today or may have gone out of use, so we can use all that information to be able to then work out how landscape has changed, but then also we can use those things that may have been lost, like place names, to then try and get back into documentary sources. So the project has been developed by a number of partners. We have the Study for the Institute of Welsh Estates at Bangor, Aberystwyth University and the Royal Commission, as well as help from the North East Wales Archive Service and the National Library of Wales. And this project is being funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And what we're doing is to try and create a deep map by which we can take all these historic documentary sources, which I've just outlined, to stick them into a digital environment by which people can get access to them. But also what we want to do is to go even further. So it's not just about making these maps available, it's actually using a process called total digitization to actually polygonize or make polygons that overlay with these maps and then contain information in them. So what do we mean when I refer to a deep map? Well, effectively, we look at landscape, and especially landscape history, as different layers on a cake. Each map source, because it ranges in times of a period, is a layer on that cake. And as you go through the different layers, you can then regress the landscape back to how it would have looked like in the past. So the core ethos of this project is to basically take all these different mapping layers, which I discussed earlier, and bring them into a central location, or this framework. This not only allows you to visualize the landscape, but also allows you to analyze the landscape as well. So the framework we use to do this is what we call GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. So most of you will be familiar with things like GIS because Google Earth is a form of GIS as well as Google Maps. So what we can do is we can take all these maps, overlay them on top of one another, and then we can also create data from them by which we can then fully interrogate them and get information out of them. So with regards to the project area, what I will say is the project that we're currently doing is a pilot, basically to test out our methodology. So rather than doing a very large area, we decided to do a very small area and to focus on 6 parishes in North East Wales. First of all, we decided to choose Mould because there was an urban area and we knew there hadn't been, although there's been a lot of development recently, we knew that prior to 1880 there'd been very little, it's always been a very small market town. And then we decided that we'd do Nerquist and Trythyn to the south of Mould because we had historic sources in this area that go back to about 1620. On the other side, we decided to do the parishes of Llandegla, Llanarmon and Llanferris. And again, all these parishes, what they have in common is a good ratio between managed land and common land. Now, the common land's important because we know that prior to 1700, when those enclosure maps were done, that there would have been very little change in these areas. So about 50% of the area we were covering, we knew that we wouldn't have historic mapping sources prior to 1700, and the landscape in essence would still be medieval. We also chose this area because we wanted to understand boundaries. So the boundary between Flintshire and Denbighshire is very interesting because if you go back 100 years or so, the actual Flintshire-Denbighshire boundary was very different. So this is a snapshot roughly of the parishes between 1880. And you can see there's a big swathe of Llanarmon that was actually in Flintshire. And also the parishes of Nerquist and Trythyn today, which are parishes, historically they were townships of Mould. So we wanted to understand how those things have progressed over time. Although relatively recent in terms of historiography, we still wanted to understand that. But then also you've got the even older things. So prior to 1600, the Act of Union, you've got the commots and cantrevs. So you can see here that these are, as we understand, although there needs to be a little bit of revision on these data sets, this is showing the commots of the area, and you can see that Llanferris, Llanarmon and Llandegla are all in the commot of Jarl, and Ystrad is basically constitutes the majority of Mould. And then between those two, you've then also got Tygengl and Powys-Fadog as the cantrevs. So again, being able to understand this area not only in terms of how landscapes developed, but also the administrative boundaries was important. So this small pilot project has a number of objectives. So the first is to gather, digitise and polygonize all of the relevant surveyed maps within the area, and this is going to give us this deep map. The second is to gather data on the methodology and how intensive it is. So I'll explain a little bit about the next section, but we wanted to see how, if we could do this on a larger scale, so potentially for the whole county and, being very optimistic for the whole of Wales. We wanted to create a publicly accessible online GIS platform, which all this data can be accessed for free by the public. And to use the data created from surveys maps, is it possible then to take that information and map older sources, things like wills, rentals, charters, things that were never maps but have geographic information in them. The next objective then is developing a deep map that can help us understand the development of Welsh estates and ask specific questions. And this is where the Institute for the Study of Welsh Estates, that's their primarily research aim. Develop a system that will enable the spatial search of archived material. So all of these maps are held in different locations by different bodies. So by bringing them together in one place but referring back to the original source, we can almost use this as an archive catalogue to be able to get these sources not only accessible by the public, but they can use that to link back then to the original source of the information. Importing all the mapping sources into a deep map will identify areas where our idea of landscape development is patchy. So, you know, we can basically use this deep map to say, well, we know about this area and we've got records that go back a long way, but there might be other areas where our understanding stops at 1800, and that we can then say, well, actually, this is where we need to focus the research on because this is where we don't have the information. Develop a standardized methodology and assess if this framework could be used to ingest other studies. So the ultimate aim of this is to basically provide a methodology by which people doing this type of landscape research can potentially take this approach and do it themselves. So rather than, you know, an organisation or individual do it themselves, they can then put this body of work with everything else. So, you know, it's not just an isolated thing that, or people work in isolation. You can then actually bring other data sets in that other people are doing and bring it into the same framework, provided it's done in a coherent way. And the last one is to create a number of localized data sets which could help to improve other data sets. So because we have all this information and mapping that goes back a long time, you know, we can actually say, you know, you've got things like Natural Resources Wales Inventory of Ancient Woodland. Now that ancient woodland inventory only goes to about 1880 because the latest or the earliest maps they have access to are the first edition. Well, because we're consulting information that goes back, you know, almost 200 years prior to this, we can actually say, well, you know, the ancient woodland that you've got here is ancient, was actually planted in, you know, 1790, whereas this area of woodland, which you have here, was you know, the earliest map we've got it on, it's still extant, and that might be 1600. So we can actually improve these data sets as and when we go on. And also, like I said before, having a data set, you know, because these maps have township boundaries on, we can then extract the township boundaries and create a township boundary map for Wales. So the methodology has three main steps to create this deep map. So the first is digitization, the second is georeferencing, and the third is polygonization. So the first thing we do, once we've identified the mapping sources that we want to use, is to get those maps from the archive and digitized into a digital format. So as part of the project, the National Library of Wales have thankfully put their expertise to take these maps for us and digitize them using their range of digitization software and hardware, and they have given us the digital copies. This has two things. One, we can use it as the project, as the product, but also it's helping archive these things. A lot of these maps have never been digitized before, so by digitizing them, we're helping to preserve them because, you know, once you have a digitized copy, you don't need to get the original out as often. You can make that digitized version available to the public. So once we've got our digitized map, the next process is then to what we call georeference the map over a modern map. So this is a process by which we take the historic map, we use a number of control points, so we stick them usually either corners of fields or anything like that, features that exist both on the historic map and the modern map, and then we can use those points to then orientate it to a modern map, and that will then stretch, warp and fit the map or the historic map to the modern map to make it geographically accurate. So once we've finished the georeferencing of fitting the historic map to the modern map, the next process then is this process called polygonization. And what this means is that effectively we can create a digital layer that represents the historic map underneath. So we basically generate polygons for each field, building or feature, anything that's displayed on the historic map. So to do this, we take a modern digital layer, and there is one called Ordnance Survey Master Map. We basically change and alter the modern polygons, so a building or a field, to actually reflect the historic map underneath. Now, because we know that the historic map has been georeferenced to fit the modern map as best we can, we know where the changes are and what we need to merge and what we need to split. And once we've got that polygon layer, what we can do is there's a database that sits behind it. So for each polygon, you can then put down the information about what field number it is, if there's a field name or a building name, and any information that's in like either a book of reference or whatever, we can then stick in the database. So the idea is that if you then click on that polygon, you'll get all the information that's both recorded in the map as well as any other ancillary information related to that specific feature. So to give you an example of how we do this digitization process, you can see we've got a first edition OS map sheet on screen. We overlay the modern master map polygons. So these red lines basically are polygons, and you can see that they overlay quite, relatively well with the historic map underneath, showing that there hasn't really been that much change between, when it was surveyed in the 1800s to the modern day. But you can see there are areas where things have changed. So what we do is we then we take a copy of this data set and we cut and merge those polygons to create a new data set which reflects the historic map underneath, and you can see there's a lot more correlation there. And then we can then take the information and put it in an attribute table. So each time you click on one of those polygons, it will open up a database which shows that entry. So say for instance you click on 177, you can click on that, it'll open the attribute table, and all the information that's recorded in the map or any other documentation is then recorded in that attribute information. And so the next thing we do then is, once we've done that whole data set for the first edition, we do exactly the same process, but we do for the next map in the sequence. So once you've done the first edition OS, you then move on to the tithe. You follow the same process. You digitize it, you georeference it, and then you create polygons. But rather than using master map, you actually take a copy of the polygons you created for the first edition OS. And because those two are, closer in date, there's a range of 50 years, there should be a lot more correlation than if you were doing it with the modern master map. So the idea is then you can create the same polygon layer, a polygon data set for the tithe. And then once you've done that, you then go back in time to the next map in the sequence, which could be the enclosure maps. And so basically this process of digitize, rectify, polygonize, repeat, and you do that until you get back as far back as you can. So what are the benefits of actually doing all this work to polygonize the maps? Well, first of all, we actually have data that we can interrogate and play with. If you've got just a digital map, yes, you can see things and visualize, but it's very hard to do anything other than that. With the polygon data, because there's more things behind it, we've got the attribute table with the other information or ancillary information that's either in the map or with other sources that are associated with the map. We can, at a click, get that information at our fingertips. The other thing we can do is that, these are two examples of the tithe maps. Well, we can stitch them together with the polygon data very neatly. There's one thing we couldn't do with the physical map itself. We couldn't cut up the original archive image, that would be terrible. But also, with the digital stuff, we can actually make it so it fits together, snugly. These two, again, with the digital images, don't fit together perfectly because they were never surveyed at the same time, and there are subtle differences. But with the polygon data, because it's an approximation, we can use this to merge these things together seamlessly. The other thing we can do is just overlay two polygon data sets over one another. So we can see here that the purple is the historic data and the grey is modern master map. And we can see that at a glance that if you can see grey, it's where there's been change, over time. So anything that's purple existed in 1800, anything that's grey is later. So we can see that landscape progression. And as a quick example here, you can see on screen, there's a collection of houses there. Well, they didn't exist prior to 1880. They are a modern construct. They were constructed sometime post 1880. So we can see straight at a glance how landscape has changed. The other thing we can do is actually visualize land use. One of the things you can't do on a map unless the symbology is there to show it is actually show land use. We can do this at a click of a button. We can change colors, we can change themes. So this is just a quick example of showing, what's unenclosed land, what's woodland, what's an agricultural field. this again shows Nerquist, and we can see at a glance how the landscape was being used. The other thing we can do as well is, if we have the information, again with the Nerquist tithe map, they actually list the farms and which fields belong to which farm. So at a glance we can actually see which land belonged to which farm. So we can see, you know, straight away how the landscape has been divided between individual farms. The last thing we can do is also, because especially with the tithe map, we've got things like the ownership and occupiers of that land. We can actually work out the gender bias of land ownership. So Nerquist here, you can see that a lot of Nerquist was owned by females. This tends to go back because there's one land, Elizabeth Gifford, who owned Nerquist Hall. She is recorded as being the main landowner. But again, you know, this is quite interesting for the 21st century, looking at, you know, gender studies and things like that, we've got all this information that you can start doing some statistical analysis of historic gender and bias and things like that. So finally, historic documentary sources. And the challenge of this project really is, how can we take these non-cartographic you know, documentary sources like rentals, wills and charters, how can we incorporate that information into a cartographic map? Well, the interesting thing about those 5 sources we've talked about is they give us a wealth of information, such as field names, land ownership, you know, of people who occupy the land and things like that, that may have been lost, or we don't know that information that goes through straight to today. So we can use things like field names that may have been lost, you know, post tithe survey, but existed before then, to then try and link that to an historic documentary source. So for instance, if you've got an enclosure map which says, well, this land was actually called Gethley-Gunnan, but then that name doesn't survive post 1700, we can then look for an historic document, maybe a rental or a will or a charter, that may be from a similar time period or a little bit earlier. But if they have the same names, we can then start thinking, well, okay, this documentary source names these field names, and these field names appear on this later map. Perhaps they are one and the same thing. So we can potentially recreate or draw a historic map from a documentary source that was never really intended to be a map, although they do have geographical information in them. The other thing we can do is that, you know, if we can get this detective story of working out who owned what, you know, if you've got a landowner, say in 1600, who is, you know, Elizabeth Gifford, and then you've got another person who's something Gifford, you can then start tracing the detective story through that line, saying, well, okay, we know that this person owned it at this date, and then is there in the historic record another family member that was prior to them, and then you can go down that avenue of interrogation. So it's allowing us to get those channels of investigation. So bringing all this stuff together in one area allows us to investigate these things together. So this is just a slide showing the links to the websites that we've created, so you can get access to some of the information we've been able to put up online. So the project's been going since September 2020 and will end in September 2022. And since then we've been able to put a series of data sets, primarily the Mould Town Plan from 1871, as well as some other information on another web map to do with Nerquist, Trithen and Mould. So these are the OS and tithe maps, and you can get access to these now. What I'll ask is if the moderator could put those links into the chat following this, that would be great. So you guys can then take those links, stick them into your search engine, and you'll be able to play with this data tonight or as and when you feel fit. So in terms of the timetable going forward until the end of September, when the project comes to an end, over the next week or so, we hope to have all the first edition OS mapping completed. The first edition OS mapping itself is online and ready to look now, and we hope to have the polygons uploaded by the end of next week. In February, we hope to finish off the tithe maps. So at the moment, Nerquist and Trithen have been uploaded, so we hope to finish, you know, Llanberis, Llanarmon, Llandegla and Mould by the end of February. By March, again, we hope to have all the enclosure maps uploaded and the estate maps by May. and then between then and the end of the project we'll be focused solely on the documentary sources, and if we can get some of them converted to a map format and uploaded too. So things will be uploaded. Those links that I've provided won't change between now and the end of the project, so please do check back regularly to see what we've uploaded, and watch this space. So just to round up, I thought I'll put this last slide together just to hopefully convince you of some of the benefits of what all this work will mean and how it can be used. First of all, this process, although it's labour intensive and does take, not a long time to do, but it is quite a lot of work. What I would say is that you only need to do this thing once. The process is do once, use many times. You are doing, that's why we call it total digitisation. You're digitising everything you can and getting a format that is reusable. But once you've got that data in that format, so with those polygons, you can then take that data and do whatever you want with it. You can use it in an historical context. Obviously, that's my background and I'm interested in landscape history. It's ready made for that. But it doesn't just have to fit in there. You've got information there that could be used by local or regional government for things like development and planning. You've also got things that could be used for the natural environment, things like ancient woodland inventory. You can improve that. And that might have some bearing on how we want to manage the landscape going forward to be more sustainable. All this information can be used by many different people and many different organisations. And it's not just limited to heritage. But the other thing is then you can build on this data. I mentioned before the town plan, you can use census records. Well, you could use census records across all of this. If you've got census records going back to 1840, you can actually put a location now with those census records, those families, and that then opens up the whole area of genealogy. Victorian directories, again with the town plan, would most fit into this, where you've got businesses and things like that. Historical newspapers, again, you've got a wealth of resource there that are in these archives, but you can actually put a geospatial slant. You can actually put a location of where things have happened or events have happened. So, and these are just a few examples. There's many more I'd go on about, but I'm quite conscious of time. But suffice to say, once we've got this information there, we can build upon that and make even better data sets, better information, and also make it more usable for people of all backgrounds, persuasions, and not just for research, but it's data that's there for everyone. So hopefully I'm going to hand over now to myself in the future to give you a quick demonstration. I appreciate we've gone slightly over time, but I would like to thank you for listening, and if you've got any questions or queries, please feel free to put them in the chat now. And also, if you don't want to ask questions now but would like to get in touch, please find my contact details on the screen now. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.